Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish. My name's Corri Wilson. I'm joined this afternoon by Jim Todd, who's the Provost of East Ayrshire Council, and Brian McGinley, who's the Deputy Council Leader for East Ayrshire Council. Sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. Deputy Council Leader for South Ayrshire Council. Right. And also Jamie Szymkowiak. Apologies, Jamie, being dyslexic, I get a bit ruffled when it comes to unusual words and names, who's the founder of the 1 in 5 campaign. So welcome, gentlemen. It's good to have you here this week. Obviously, top of the topics this week has been Brexit yet again. I don't think we've had a programme that we've not had Brexit. And last week we saw this historic first where the UK Parliament were found in contempt of Parliament because they failed to publish the full legal advice. It kind of seems a bit strange to me that this, thing has happened, but it's almost as if it's just going away. It's like nothing to see here. But what concerns me is that, how can we expect any MPs to be able to vote on something if they don't have the full facts? Would you agree, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where you've got to have as much knowledge as possible to make decisions, because after all, this is one of the most important decisions that anybody in the United Kingdom will experience. It's got to be done properly, and it's got to be seen to be done properly, because if it doesn't, then there'll always be that ill feeling going on.
Do you think, Brian, that obviously the way they talk in Parliament is the third party language, and you're not allowed to say you because apparently any MP is not responsible for any action, but surely ultimately they are responsible for what they're doing, particularly if you're in government.
Absolutely, and I think, Corri, winding it back a little bit, I think there are some real fundamental problems here in the way that we conduct our business in politics, and part of that is about politicians not taking responsibility. They are elected by the people, and they need to stand up and say, this is what I believe in, and take it on the chin if they get it wrong, but stand up and be counted instead of hiding behind party politics, governance issues, and all the other excuses that they make to wheedle out of taking responsibility. So I think there's a real problem here about how politicians are allowed even to make their point and make the principled stand. And this is just one example of where people are coalescing around an idea, or a government in this case, and showing contempt for their peers. Now, as you say, it's the first time in history that this has been so obvious that they have refused to give this information. Clearly, a key plank of information that would determine whether the outcome of the vote. And I think we'll discuss this maybe a bit later, but there are some fundamental issues about having respect for your peers and having systems in place that actually allow you to do your job as part of a democratic culture and arrangement, rather than hiding behind processes and procedures that keep people at a distance and don't allow people to take the responsibility, or don't encourage them to do that. So some real fundamental issues here, I think.
Yeah. What I'm really concerned about is the fact that chaos has become the new normal, and something like contempt of Parliament, as you said, Corri, is just yesterday's news already, and we're moving forward so quickly. And that's not happened in the history of the British Parliament before. I'm currently living in Berlin and watching what's happening through, closed fingers to see what's happening in the next day's debate, and seeing how quickly things are moving, and people are not digesting what's actually happening in Parliament and the impact that it's going to have on people's lives.
Do you think also, Jamie, there seems to be a thing about the way elected members are treated at times, and instead of, we're all human, and humans make mistakes, but it's this thing where they don't seem to be able to own up to that mistake and say, do you know what, actually I think we've taken the wrong direction, we need to stop, rethink, reevaluate and move forward.
Yeah, I think there's a prime example, Priti Patel, fairly recently just comparing or saying that the UK government could stop supporting Ireland with food, and I think just the gall of that was actually breathtaking in terms of forgetting about the history of the Irish famine. So yeah, I think sometimes politicians need to take a step back, remember that people are going to be affected by the decisions that they make.
And obviously, earlier in the week as well, we had the Scottish Parliament who voted to reject Theresa May's Brexit deal. Now, clearly, this was a symbolic vote because it didn't, it doesn't actually mean anything. But obviously, Holyrood wanted it put on record that they are, opposition to the Westminster plans. But it appears that from the vote that every party in Holyrood except the Tories obviously agree that Brexit's not going to be good for Scotland. Would you agree with that, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things again where the devolved administrations and all of the countries that make up the United Kingdom, obviously it's a numbers issue. When Scotland voted 62% to remain in the European Union, then that's just wiped out because of a numbers issue. How people got to that vote at that time are different. It's different perspectives for different areas in the United Kingdom. And it goes without saying there was a real push for anti-immigration, especially in the home counties down in England. And that manifested itself in the range of votes and the depth of votes for leave. I think a lot of rhetoric was put out, and I totally agree with what Brian was saying about honour among politicians. If you're going to say something to encourage somebody to go along with your point of view and vote for your policies that you believe in, hopefully you believe in, then you've got to have a level of integrity and honesty when you're putting these things out. Unfortunately, we saw the opposite during the campaign.
Do you think, Brian, picking up on that point, that at that particular time people didn't really know what they were voting for?
Well, yes, I think there was, like Jamie says, chaos is the new norm, and that's intentional. That's not unintentional. Yeah. And the landscape is confused because they want to get their agenda on the table and mitigate anybody else who has any alternative view. Because they often can't stand up and justify what it is they're saying. It's often not passionate, it's often not based in principle, it's based in pragmatism or convenience. And this is a very good example we've seen here, where, for example, somebody officially and formally have said, yes, I'm against Brexit. All of a sudden, when things are changing, I'm now for Brexit, and I'm against Brexit, and the changes are, I'm now doing this on that behalf. So, and people need to stand and be accountable for what they do, but ultimately it causes confusion among the electorate. And the second point I would make is a lot of that vote was based on lies, based on people knowingly telling lies, post-truth politics, people saying, yes, we will put X amount of that money that was going to Europe into the NHS. Lies, things like that, and then somersaulting to say, and the latest thing was, oh, it's not just about the economy. No, it's going to be bad for the economy, apparently. Now, if you'd have said that during the referendum or before the referendum, people would have woken up to that. Now they're saying it was always a bit much more than that, So there are real issues about then, when the truth comes out, for people then to still say, oh, we're holding to the vote, but actually not saying, well, how did we come to that, and was the method flawed, and is that then a genuine outcome when we find that the basis in which the evidence was presented was fundamentally flawed.
Picking up on Brian's point about the vote being based on lies, it feels a bit like, Jamie, that the lies have continued and we've not learned any lessons, and we're actually, and to use your words, as big a chaos as we've ever been. Would you just say that was accurate?
Well, I think a lot of the politicians have actually put themselves in a corner. I think it's important to remember why it is this contempt of government came about in the first place. It's because in the UK Parliament, the MPs voted to have the legal advice published, and the UK government tried to withhold that information. So you've got the Attorney General's words in black and white, the impact of the backstop and what that's going to do to the United Kingdom. And then you've got MPs like David Mundell, the Secretary of State of Scotland, going on TV earlier on today and saying that he's taken a view that his decisions and his words that he used earlier are just part of a negotiating tool. And it goes back to what I said earlier. These words mean a lot to people. And when politicians change their mind and renege on what they say, just a matter of weeks or minutes even after that's happened, it sort of breeds a distrust in politics, which is unfortunate.
And obviously this week we saw the European Union Advocate General saying his statement that he thinks that the Article 50 could be revoked, and basically Brexit could be stopped. Do you think that's an option, and do you think it's even going to happen, Jamie?
Well, we've got the result being announced tomorrow by the European Court of Justice. Personally, I just love the timing of it. There was a tweet that came out saying that it's going to, from the European Court of Justice, saying that they were going to make the announcement before the meaningful vote, and I think it's going to be 9 p.m. tomorrow that it's announced. So I just love the trolling coming from the EU on the timing of it.
Do you think, Brian, what are your thoughts on the outcome? When this decision's going to come tomorrow, and then obviously the MPs are going to have to vote. They've already seen where we are now. Do you think that it's going to have an impact on the outcome?
Well, again, it comes back to that point about whether every MP has a free vote. Do you know? And are they looking at the evidence that is presented to them, or other issues of arm twisting and promises and other things behind the presenting arguments? So I have a worry that if you look at history, that deals are done, and it's not always in the best interests of the common 5/8. It's not always best interest of citizens, but it's about the machine. It's about the political machine seen to be working. One of the big things that social media does is it exposes politicians, and I think rightly so. But in the past, they would hide behind procedure and all those things, and this persona of what an MP is. But people see them for what they are, and rightly so. And that's why I think it's important that people come from the community that they represent, because then they're seen warts and all. But here I think there are some fundamental issues about the government trying to get its way, regardless of whether the independent assessment tells you that this is the best thing for the people. That's a real worry.
Do you think, Jim, that if this ruling doesn't suit Theresa's agenda, she's going to pay any heed to it anyway?
Well, I've got a concern, and the concern is that through silence emanating from Westminster, that it looks like, in my opinion, that there might be a change with some MPs who were very vocal against the deal. I hope that's not the case. An interesting point and an important point, during the Scottish referendum 2014, there was a lot of rhetoric put out about businesses will not like any change. You can't change a thing because businesses are ruling. That's the capitalist system, that's the system we work under. Unfortunately, the pendulum swung too far to the right. But the problem here is, we have multinational industries in Ayrshire, and I was talking to a couple of chief executives from a couple of those companies, and they have serious concerns over raw material supply. We've heard about the 40,000 trucks that will be parked outside Dover with only 7,000 certificates to get through customs. That will have a serious impact on businesses in Ayrshire and beyond. We are now looking at stockpiling raw materials. You only get these raw materials from Europe. The issue that I think the Scottish Government has got to grasp the thistle, the metal if you like, and open up Leith, Rosyth, Grangemouth, Aberdeen, and we start to trade directly with Europe. Now, what's Westminster going to do? Are they going to say you can't do that? The Scottish Government says, you're not doing it. We have businesses here, hundreds of thousands of jobs relying on raw material supply from Europe, and you have not given us a guarantee that we can get these raw materials. Businesses are going to suffer. That never gets spoken about because it's all this stuff about Brexit means Brexit. And of course, the mantra was a no deal is better than a bad deal. Well, there's been a flip on that side, hasn't there?
And I think this week saw Theresa, she sent 30 ministers across the country to sell her Brexit deal. But, at the end of the day, the people they were speaking to, the businesses, they're not going to have the vote. They're not going to have... And I just wonder what the purpose of that visit was, do you think, Brian? What are they...
Well, I think that's that example I used earlier on about having a fundamental disrespect for your peers. That's simply ignoring the MPs in Parliament and going over their heads to talk to the other people across the country. That's a tactic to put pressure on the MPs. But it's not right. and I don't think it will give them the result that they're looking for. I'll tell you why, because it's economically, it's such a disaster. You know, they can't, you know, make that right. You know, certification, you know, as Jim mentioned, European approvals. I mean, at Prestwick Airport, for example, all of those the aviation business, a lot of them do their certifications through logistic companies. Now, it's going to be horribly difficult and far more complicated than it's ever been. The idea of Europe was always about getting goods flowing rather than controlling goods, and now we're going back to a stage where we're trying to control, and when you control, that slows up the process, and when you slow up the process, that costs money, and when you cost money, then people make decisions about where they're going to locate and invest to make the best options for the product. Now, just one quick example. I understand that, for example, if this whole, one of the main facets of this Brexit idea was to get more control of our economy, more control of our business enterprise, but apparently, because we're pulling out, if we do pull out of Brexit, it now seems likely that if and when the financial sector through government, through London, is operating, they will have to do apply to different regulations that they don't have any input into. So they'll be forced on them. So you're having less control over your businesses than is first muted. So real concerns, and tremendously worries me.
You spoke there, Jim, about the businesses you'd spoke to. So do you think these ministers got the same information from the businesses they visited? Surely, you know, these businesses didn't go, yeah, this is going to be a great idea. Surely they must have been saying to them, you know, here is our concerns. Big long list.
If you did a trawl, and I did look superficially of the businesses that were visited that last inspection, these were most of them were businesses that all of their raw materials came from the UK. So the cynical part in my mind tells me that it was absolutely planned out, that there would be no awkward questions from chief executives and workers saying, how about the continuity of supply? Yeah, that's what politicians do. But to go on a visit in Scotland for 20 minutes to a company that gets most of its supply locally, it didn't really go around the whole country and ask their advice. The concerns that I've got really are this strong and stable society we're meant to have, that businesses rule. But going beyond that, and it's this thing beyond that, I think that Jamie and Brian touched on, this end goal for Brexiteers, and it's this thing about taking back control. We don't get control. The person in the street doesn't get any control. Their life will not change whatsoever, apart from food costs going up, apart from supply dwindling. There'll be less choice. And the main thing, and I've heard politicians talking about this, and it's this free trade issue. And the free trade issue really worries me, because I'm an active trade unionist. And it's one of these things that people don't seem to realise, that it wasn't Westminster government, successive UK governments, that gave the working man and woman protection. It came from Europe. Now, in Europe you're a citizen, in the United Kingdom you're a subject. And that is a clear change. Everybody talks about citizens, quite rightly. We're European citizens. I'm a European citizen. But where you have a constitution in Europe, where you're protected as a citizen, you've got no protections whatsoever as a subject, because the government of the day at Westminster can change whichever law they want, and that directly affects you. And we've had right-wing Tory politicians coming out publicly and saying they want free trade, they want to burn red tape, they want to do away with all legislation. And the only way down for workers, the only way is down for workers in the UK, because there will be no protections whatsoever.
I think, Corri, you mentioned, or the root of your question was, is that going to have any impact? Is the MPs and the government officials going amongst the people going to make any change? And I think that if you read the Sunday Times this morning, they're reporting that the meaningful vote on Tuesday might be delayed. So I think the government themselves have realised that it's not having any impact. I think we have become aware of you only have to see photos on social media which shows that when these politicians go into companies, there's only about 5 people and it's very well stage managed. So I think we're seeing through it, and I think the government realise that, and that's why potentially Tuesday's meaningful vote might be postponed.
And linked to Brexit, Jamie, the Home Office last week said that they would block the Scottish Government's attempts to help EU citizens living north of the border. The Scottish Government were going to pay the fees, and obviously from our point of view, EU citizens living and working in Scotland is crucial to our economy and our public services, particularly things like the NHS. And from the flip side of that, you said yourself you're living in Berlin at the moment and not sure what that's going to mean. Is this all just a bit petty, this kind of, does it really matter where the money's come from as long as it was, the fees were paid?
I think it does matter where it comes from, because I think that you mentioned the NHS. As a disabled rights activist, the social care in NHS is incredibly important to disabled people. And if we don't have the workforce in those areas, there'll be a lot of disabled people in Scotland wondering where they're going to get their personal assistance from, where their support's going to come from, or any medical support that they need. Something else that I found quite interesting along the similar lines was the UK government issued information relating to this just a couple of days ago, whereby there's only one place in Scotland, which is in Edinburgh, where EU nationals can go to register, and they have to use an Android phone, not an Apple phone. Then there's questions around who actually, what happens if you don't have a mobile phone? What if you can't pay the bill that you need to in order to upload your data? So there's lots of questions, and how many people is it excluding? And we don't yet have the information relating to that.
In terms of, you said yourself about the sort of uncertainty you're facing, but it must be the same for EU nationals living here, not sure what's going to happen to them, if they're going to be able to stay, and if they've maybe been here for a while and built up a life here, and it must be terribly unsettling for them.
Yeah, well, I can only tell you anecdotal stories of friends that I have when I lived in Edinburgh that are originally from Poland and have decided to move back over the course of the last 2 years. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. The Polish economy is doing better than it was historically, but also it's just the general feeling of uncertainty. And that's, taxpayers in Scotland that have decided to relocate and move. So it's really vitally important that people over the course of the next couple of weeks and months ahead focus on the impact of what our politicians and the decisions that they're going to make are going to have in our lives.
And turning to, staying with Brexit, but we're turning to local authorities now. Obviously, there's ongoing concern around things like loss of EU funding, the migrant worker situation, even tourism. From a local authority perspective, what are the Brexit issues, Brian, that you've been worried about or talked about?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what Jamie was saying, what Jim was saying, that fundamentally the main issue, you were asking whether it was petty that you're not paying to keep people here. But I think it's more about privileging the process and not worried about setting precedent than it is about trying to help people who are in very, very difficult circumstances to get out of those circumstances. And I think that's a fundamental problem. So where we are trying in local authority terms, we want to keep people working in the NHS, we want to keep people working for the councils locally, and they're vital to our workforce. But there doesn't seem to be a willingness to put them front and centre to ensure that they're allowed to continue. But it's not just about these individuals, it's about their partners and their families. There are people who have been here for 10s, 20s, 30s years who have children and who are now in Europe or whatever. It's complex in terms of the actual impact on a whole range of families. It's not just about individuals. But locally, I think what we're trying to do is we certainly know who the people are that work for our councils, so that we've identified those, and that's important. We've sent them out information about how to handle that, and we're engaging with them to see what their particular circumstances are, because like any good employer would do that. The difficulty is we don't know what the context is and how it's going to apply, but we're doing everything we can, so we're very aware of that. We are worried about the structural funds and what comes after that, because in terms of economy and the social development, all of that, Scotland has done particularly well out of that. And so there are a number of issues that for us locally we need to advocate hard for local government to continue to be the place that can represent people locally, the linchpin of local democracy, and make sure that we represent and advocate for the actual impact that these structural decisions have on people's real daily lives.
And obviously one of the biggest stumbling blocks throughout this negotiation has been the British border in Ireland, and given that Cairnryan Port's just a stone's throw from the South Ayrshire border, has there been contact or discussions or things ongoing about looking at what the implications are for us?
I can't say that there has been a great deal of information. It's been more at the national level, but there are severe, I mean, we can imagine, can't we? We all know how the economy works. We know what the potential dangers are. We know what the potential issues are around that. So, you know, it's very obvious to anybody who lives in Ayrshire about the lorries and the contacts that come straight through. There's an analysis done recently, and people coming through the port there at Stranraer, you know, go to London and south of England as well as Aberdeen and places. So it's a very pivotal port. Big issues around that, and as a local authority we have had some initial discussions, but nothing that would merit the deep level of focus that it requires.
Has there been much joint discussion between the three Ayrshires in terms of Brexit and working together and impact?
Well, I think it's just a matter of wait and see what happens. There's been a lot going on, and like East Ayrshire, like South Ayrshire, putting procedures in place to look after. And it just shows you, in Ayrshire College network, in Kilmarnock College, I went along to an awards ceremony. There's a brilliant set of lecturers, some who are European, and there's English as a second language course. And there was 44 European and beyond folk, lovely folk, went along with families, and they used English as a second language. And some of them are worried, you know, about the future, what's going to happen. And is it not incredibly shocking the way some of these families have been treated? Now, I haven't witnessed it in East Ayrshire at all, but you only look at the social media, you look at the news, and there's families have been split up where the spouse or the partner's lived in Scotland for 30 years and be told by the Home Office, you're leaving. No input from the Scottish Government, no input through local authorities. You need to be out of the country by a certain date. So this whole right-wing Brexit, I won't touch on fascism yet, but it's getting towards that area where the pendulum's swinging so far to the right in the upper echelons of our society that you're treating a family like that, where you're splitting a family up, that's brought up their kids, they've contributed for 30 years into the local economy, into the national taxation system, and you're splitting families up. What a horrible place to be in.
Yeah. Jamie, before we leave Brexit, obviously we've touched on European funding, and for many organisations it's crucial, you know, that service users and organisations are supported by that funding. From, you know, a disability group's point of view, is there a concern around what impact that's going to mean?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty. So yes, it's going to impact on disabled people's organisations as well. I think that for those that are watching, just something that's tangible, that people would understand where disability rights have really moved and we've seen progress, is just air travel. So for example, airlines at the moment have to, because of EU legislation, provide support for disabled people getting on and off airplanes. So from April next year, what's the provision for that that's going to happen in our airports in Glasgow, Aberdeen and Edinburgh? We just don't know. There's not clarity on that. So disabled people that travel, that will be a big concern for them. The other thing is obviously the stockpiling of medicines. We just had reports that the UK government's going to stockpile medicines for up to 6 weeks after the date of Brexit, so to ensure that we have adequate medical supplies. But you can't stockpile medical support for absolutely every condition. And those that you do stockpile perhaps are not going to last for 6 weeks. I know that Dr. Philippa Whitford gave a really good example when it comes to cancer medicines, that you can't stockpile. So there's so much uncertainty that will impact the lives and well-being of people that you know, the UK government just needs to get its act together.
And I think following on from that, some of the other concerns would be around the protection that being, I think Jim touched on that before, about the protections that the EU give us in terms of, you know, accessibility, participation, equality, employment, training, all that kind of stuff. Is that something that is concerning you?
Yeah, of course. I think that one of the great things about the EU is how it has increased the rights that people have, and the threat of not being a part of that institution, that much larger group of people, is the erosion of rights. You know, disabled people, as well as workers, as well as women, as well as any group, have fought over decades to get the rights that we have today. And for those to be at risk of just being switched off at the end of March next year certainly causes concern.
And I know, Jamie, you've done a lot of work around disability access to politics. Do you think that if we had a better cross-section of society elected to represent us, that we wouldn't see as much of this out-of-touch policies that we seem to be getting at the moment? Do we need to broaden who our elected members are? Yeah,
well, 1 in 5, that's one of our main things, is to have the number of disabled people in Parliament match the percentage of disabled people in the population in Scotland, as 1 in 5 indicates it's 20%. The Scottish Government are doing really good work on that with the Access to Elected Office Fund, which is being run and administered by Inclusion Scotland. I know that the UK Government have just sort of reintroduced it on a trial basis for the rest of the UK. The level of funding is very, very low for it, so it's almost like they're setting up to fail. But we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, certainly there's a lot of ways in which, if you have more fair representation for disabled people, people of colour, LGBT, and for women, then hopefully through that you'll see better legislation. Yeah, yeah. And Jim, you touched earlier on in fascism, and obviously we've seen some disturbing pictures coming out of France last night. I think they reckoned over 1,000 people have been arrested because they were demonstrating against, well, really it's fuel prices that started it off, but actually I think just in general terms, I think in Europe, and we've seen this creeping in to the UK as well, that rise in that right-wing extremism, really. Did you catch any of the stuff that was coming on in France? Yeah, well, as the way with all of these things, the way these things work, you will get extremes jumping onto bandwagons. The French, the Germans, the Spanish and the Italians have always been very good at challenging decisions that can affect them. You saw it years ago with the farmers, French farmers, all the tractors coming out onto the road. They tried it in the UK with the haulage firms, but that was by various shenanigans was stopped. I won't get into that. But unfortunately, the right wing's on the move in Europe and beyond. And it's up to us to challenge, unfortunately, the way Brexit's been handled and the way it was all set out to win that vote. Everybody moved to the right. Really interesting about UKIP, because UKIP's done its job, and I think UKIP's on the withered vine now. It's interesting to see how much of those right-wing politicians and members from UKIP have joined the Tory party, which will swing the Tory party even further to the right. It's up to us all to challenge whenever we see any forms of fascism, any right-wing moves among your family, among your workmates, in society. And I do challenge. I challenge all the time. And it's interesting to see the right-wing in France, the right-wing in the UK and beyond, using the Nazi salute as some form of coming together. I think it's quite important, though, just to highlight that the Yellow Vest movement in France isn't right-wing. I agree, the core of it is actually... talking about the people that jumped onto that bandwagon. I agree. I agree. It was very well run. School children got involved, students got involved, and they've had a great history of challenge, and all power to them. But you're right, Jamie.
The initial start of the challenge to the fuel prices was honourable, and it's unfortunate that these extremes, and sometimes on both sides, can jump and hijack. And it's not the good work that the good folk have done with the Yellow Vest campaign, which is legitimate. It's unfortunate for that campaign that has been hijacked, and the press will only show you the issues.
I think it depends on where you, the media outlets
That's
that you
fair.
go to, because
That's
I think
fair.
some of the stuff that's come out from France is like Macron going into hiding, one of the MPs from his own party being challenged on live TV to answer what the minimum wage was, and the person couldn't answer. So it's that feeling of isolationism from the political elite versus the ordinary working man and woman. So I think it's very important that we don't conflate the original reasons that the Yellow Vests went out to protest.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and certainly that wasn't my intention, and it's not mine. It's not that I was, suggesting that they were at all right-wing. I think what I was trying to say was they were protesting against potentially what is seen as right-wing policies, and whether that's, capitalism and as you said, the elite against the working man. And Jim has said, the Europeans have been quite good at rising up against that, whereas I don't think we've seen so much of that in the UK. But coming closer to home now, Shelter this week, they released figures that said 130,000 children will be living in temporary accommodation this festive season, which they estimated as a rise of 59% in the last 5 years. That's a pretty shocking figure, Jim. Would you agree? Oh,
absolutely. And again, it comes round to that gap. I believe I saw a figure, and I'll probably get it wrong, but over the last 10 years, the super rich, their wealth has risen by 183% over 10 years. Absolutely incredible. And I firmly believe that no matter what happens with Brexit or independence, no matter what way the UK goes, there needs to be a financial revolution in this country, because we can't go on with people getting poorer and the other side getting richer. It used to be if you got a job, then you could work. But I know a family in Kilmarnock, and the husband works, the wife is looking after 2 children, and that fella has to jump in a car and go to East Kilbride to get work, and he works in East Kilbride. All of his money is spent on the car, getting the car, keeping the car on the road, getting it to work. And he's on the minimum wage, not even the living wage. And it's shocking. And that family uses a food bank in Kilmarnock twice a month. A working family. That cannot go on. And there needs to be a revolution, financial revolution, where everybody challenges this system, where the rich, and there's nothing wrong with a company, nothing wrong with somebody, an individual working hard and becoming successful. Brilliant, keep it going. But the gap between is getting wider and wider, and there doesn't seem to be anything that's stopping that.
Well, there might be a small financial revolution next week with the Scottish Government's budget.
Yes.
And I think it'll be interesting to see the outcome of the negotiations following Derek Mackay's presentation on whether or not the parties agree on increasing child benefit by £5, or whether they're going to invest in mitigating the child cap and the so-called rape clause that comes in the back of it, because obviously there are measures that the Scottish Government can now take. I know that there was a report just released recently by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Child Poverty Action Group in connection with a number of other organisations calling for the Scottish Government to increase the financial allowance for the child benefit by £5. So that could be something that will help the number of children that are experiencing poverty and the figures that you state there. So it'll be interesting to see the outcomes of that over the course of the next weeks ahead.
Yeah, and obviously in terms of people living in temporary accommodation, Brian, that's a knock-on effect for local authorities, because obviously you need to source and fund temporary accommodation, and whilst it's absolutely not acceptable that anybody can't call where they live their home and have a roof over their head and food on the table, but do you think that's going to have any extra issues around, for the council to deal with?
Well, certainly the council's committed to tackling individual concerns and problems. As people present homeless, we will seek to accommodate them. We take that responsibility. It's a legal responsibility, and we do that. But there's a much more fundamental issue here, and it's about what kind of society we want to live in. And rather than just trying to plaster over the cracks, we need to look at the fundamental reasons why people are homeless. And Jim's already mentioned about basic living wage, rather than the actual living wage it's costing you to live. You know, the kind of people, fuel poverty is another example of that, where big businesses are cartels essentially that are keeping prices high and people having to pay those kind of things. So there are some real fundamental issues, and Jamie's right in that kind of sense. Scotland has an opportunity now to start to say, how can we tackle some of these issues, and if they take that responsibility and that opportunity, I think that's what then shows up other more right-wing parties who are not dealing with the concerns of the people, and they then react, albeit minimalistly or in other ways, but they're forced to the table. But Jim then also mentioned this fact about we all need to take a responsibility. There is something within us that says, thank God that's not me. Yeah. I'll help out. But I would rather we say, well, wait a minute, that's not acceptable. Whether it's me or not, we need to start to say, we are meant to be a rich country. We are working, anybody who's working should have a basic minimum standard. People who involve in their communities should be able to go out the front door with confidence and avail themselves of the facilities that are around. And one of the problems with Macron is he did away with the rich tax that was there in France, and that had a fundamental effect on the amount of money that's available for social services. And those are the issues that we've been suffering over the last 10-15 years, and we need to get it on the table that that's not acceptable. And people have opportunities when it comes to votes, and you'll hear people say, no, I don't do politics. Politics is fundamental to everything you eat, everything you breathe, everything that you do in life. So get involved and look at the personalities and the commitments of politicians and hold them to account when you can.
Yeah. Jamie talked earlier on about the chaos becoming the norm, and it almost feels like in some way you know, we're kind of going back to Victorian times. People are using food banks. That's become normalised. You know, there's got to be a better way of helping everybody, in a bit, you know, what you said, Brian, about, you know, being able to everybody to play their part and everybody to challenge that this just isn't good enough and nobody should be suffering in this way, because it's just totally inhumane. And obviously last night we had the social bite sleep in the park, and they reckoned there was 110,000, I think it was, people out there, and that was mainly to raise money but to highlight the issue around homelessness. And I think from last year's event there was quite a bit of good work done following on from that in terms of trying to tackle homelessness. But sticking kind of with that area, again, figures released this week, between April and September, £60 million was paid to mitigate the bedroom tax, and councils across Scotland paid out over 100,000 awards. Do you think, Jim, that people, because this has continued to be mitigated, that people have forgotten that it exists?
Yeah, well, there is an argument out there that because of mitigation, people don't realise the full extent of what's been foisted on them from a centralised government in Westminster. But you have to do it. It has to be mitigated. And I fully support the Scottish Government in doing the things that they do. Where would we be if they didn't do that? It would be worse, if it can be any worse. So we will always support those folk. There's support mechanisms in the councils, and they work really, really well. The churches, we spoke about this earlier, the churches have really come together in a way I don't think they've done for generations. And there's a lot of work going on, and it's not an ecumenical movement, it's just the churches coming together in society to work together to help people. There is a real change. I detect a real change in people's attitudes, and unfortunately some of that change is not positive. There's a lot of me now, and that's come out over the last couple of years, the last few years. We will work, and we will always work as local politicians to make sure everybody's involved and everybody feels part of that society. But the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, through charities, through the voluntary sectors, through East Ayrshire Council, for example, has a brilliant way of giving back to the community, because every single employee can give 8 hours out of their yearly work to do voluntary work, and they still get paid. And that's a great way for extra resources to go to those places who need the extra resources. And you just need to apply, and just about every single person in East Ayrshire Council has taken advantage of that, and they do voluntary work. So we can't forget the voluntary sector, but going along with that, there has to be a route for everybody who knows where they're going to make things better. Shelter, great organisation, they do a lot of good work. We haven't touched on the real issue affecting veterans who have been involved in a lot of conflicts over the last few years that I personally disagree with. I'm the veterans champion for East Ayrshire Council, and I fully support our troops. But it's not the troops that made the decisions to go to war. It was politicians. And the Ministry of Defence has got to step up to the mark and provide more funding to local authorities to alleviate the issues that we find a lot of our ex-servicemen and women that find themselves in those situations. We're doing it locally as councils. South Ayrshire's doing it, North Ayrshire's doing it as well. There's over 700 charities in the UK for armed forces personnel, far too much. We concentrate on 4 or 5 in Ayrshire. That's Poppy Scotland, SAFA, Holybush, Combat Stress, and Veterans First Point. And these are the ones, and the Royal British Legion Scotland, Legion. We concentrate on them and we'll work with them closely. And the amount of money that's there through the benevolent societies within the ex-armed forces, there's a lot of money there, and SAFA are very good at accessing that money. So I would encourage anyone watching the programme, you don't even need to be a member. You could be your spouse or a member of your family. If they served in the armed forces, you can access some funding.
Yeah.
Corri, you're talking there about the bedroom tax, and I think sometimes you know, your point was around whether or not people think that it's just gone away in Scotland, and I think it's quite important to highlight what the bedroom tax is, because it's become one of those phrases that are thrown around in media and by politicians. And what the bedroom tax is, it is a tax on, a lot of the time, disabled people and their families. Whereby we need a spare room, an extra room for medical treatment. And I think that it's quite important to note a few things. For example, in Birmingham, just within the last year, 71 disabled families have been rehomed as a result of the bedroom tax. So where it's not happening in Scotland, it's happening elsewhere in the UK. And that's 71 families of disabled children that are having to be rehoused because of it. And the second point that I would like to make around this is just the language that's used. Sometimes I hear press releases, whether it's from the Scottish Government or whether it's from other political parties, around mitigating this, and we'd much rather have the opportunity to spend the money on something else. That may be the case, but disabled people often feel like they're a burden, and that type of language that's used in this debate just accentuates that. And I also think that if we're looking at ways in which that we can mitigate the child cap that Alison Thulis MP is working and leading on, and around the rape clause policy, again we need to just be conscious of the language that we're using around this, and not think of it as, oh, we'd much rather be spending money on X, Y and Z instead of this, because, you know, survivors of rape or disabled people, often it's very brave, or they're just worried about coming forward in the first place. So just conscious of the language around it.
I
think that's a good point. But can I add to that, Corri?
Yeah.
That it's not just about the conversations we have around particular issues, but there are some fundamental issues here, and it's about language, which you're absolutely right, Jamie, but it's also about ideas. The idea I came up with earlier was the structure and the propaganda and the ideology over people's circumstances. There's a common thread here through. They don't care about the people's circumstances, including whether you're disabled, whether you have other issues, and we as leaders, as politicians, as campaigners, as people who are concerned about the kind of society we live in, we need to not just get dragged into trying mitigating the individual circumstances. We need to take a step back and say, what is going on here? I don't agree that that's the narrative. I think fundamentally, if someone needs an extra room, they should have the extra room. Those are the principles in which we should be arguing upon. Because otherwise we just get into a very detailed argument about what you've got and what I don't have, and if I don't do this, then you don't get that. Instead, if we step back and say we have a fundamental respect for people's dignity, fundamental respect for people's conditions of life, their abilities, and when they do contribute, they get rewarded appropriately for that. Those are the kind of things that we should be talking about, and don't get dragged in to always being on the back foot to try and mitigate these horrible ideological ideas that come through, that when people don't understand the consequences of people's real life.
Because I think that there's a narrative there, isn't there, around that blame culture.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to blame whether it's immigrants or disabled people or somebody else. You know, as long as you can put the spotlight on somebody else, then, you know, it takes it away from who you should be putting the spotlight on, really.
Well, that's and the crux of what Brian was saying was that we've got no control. And that's what it comes down to. Whether you're an independent Scotland or part of the United Kingdom, that control has got to come to those areas, because we are different. We're all the same, but we've got different views on the way things should work.
And you know, for me, the important thing is, though, we do have power in our hands, don't we, Jamie? We can make a difference in our local areas, and it's from that bottom up that makes the difference. And it's about that commonality and that way of working that we challenge those who are in the power, because, you know, politicians need to remember that this is a given power. It's a temporary power that's invested in them by the people, and they often try and wiggle out of that. They want to try and find ways in which to go beyond and secure themselves and look after themselves. And we as an electorate need to hold the politicians to account. I know I've said that on a number of occasions, but there are limited opportunities in which to do that. But coalescing together, working and supporting each other in our own difficult circumstances is a way that we could be a way of developing a more we society rather than this me society. I'm going to turn to councils now and just quickly touch on everybody's favourite topic, which is bins. And I know in South and East Ayrshire you've rolled out a new bin regime. Why do you think there's always so much resistance when it comes to this topic? I think people don't like change. And I also think change has been accumulated over a number of periods of time, and our ambitions have changed over a number of times as we have realised that we're putting all this stuff into landfill, and we can't keep doing that. So we have this commitment from the Scottish Government that says we're going to stop putting stuff into landfill in January 2020, understand? So we need to come up with alternative ways in which to do this. And there's new technology developing all the time, so the way in which we process this, we now in South Ayrshire, for example, and I know in East as well, we're separating out what is recyclable and how we can actually use that. Because in the past we haven't just been as clinical and actually working out where we would put things and how we would reuse or dissect or whatever we would do to that. So we have the food situation, we have the glass bottles and all of that. So it's quite a complex issue, but the more definitive we are and how we collect it means that we protect it to be able to use it in a different way. So, for example, we have now 6 bins, which seems a lot, but we're building on the 4 we already have, and we're dividing out cardboard, which is easier to recycle and other things. But there is a big issue too. Technology is getting better, and we need to find ways of transforming that rubbish, if you like, the waste, into sources of energy like heat energy and other things. So again, that would help with the society of doing district heating, tackling fuel poverty and other things. So we need to be a bit more imaginative about how we use and reuse the stuff that were just thrown away without any real concern.
But taking that issue wider, another big headache for the council is litter, and it does seem to be that, you know, people think that it's the council's responsibility. It's if you drop something, you're keeping somebody in a job, or it's community service that should be doing it. People have stepped away from their own personal responsibility. Do you think we're going to be able to change that mindset?
Yeah, I think we will. I honestly think we will. Things are changing. You know, when I go and talk to students, go to talk to young folk at schools, I always start with an apology, because the way it's supposed to work, our society, all the old folk, all the mature folk are supposed to hand over the world in a better state than we found it. So I always apologise, because I don't think we can say that at this time. But I always have a shining light, and the shining light is our young folk. Our young folk are far more clued to what's happening to the world. They know about plastic pollution, they know about microbeads in the ocean. And I've got a lot of faith in our young folk. Our young folk are going to come along, and if there were a lot more women in power in the world, I think the world would be a safer place. But our young folk is going to lead us, and they'll lead us into a better direction in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Plastics, real issue, massive issue. And there's a whole host of different ways of dealing with it. You see in Africa that they're using plastic, partially melting the plastic, turning it into housing bricks, and then it's sealed with clay. So how that works out, we don't know. We have looked at, as South Ayrshire, North Ayrshire has done, Carlisle Council and Cumbria have looked at using plastic in some of the asphalt that goes onto the roads. It's about 5%, and that's all they can really use. It's captured in the tar. But we're always looking at ways to deal, and plastics are the real issue.
I think one of the things that, you know, touching the things that you guys have both said about incentivising people in different ways. In Germany, we have the bottle banks. So people take their plastic bottles to the supermarket, they get a token, and then they can use that at the end of their weekly shop. And I know that's something that's coming to Scotland in the near future. So I think just looking at ways in which we can incentivise people to actually recycle is going to be a really big help.
And I think, Jamie, there was, in terms of the recent move to get rid of plastic straws and stuff, and again that caused a bit of a backlash, because probably not everybody was consulted in just what that impact was being. I think, if I'm right in saying, that some disabled people really do need plastic straws, and it's about how everybody's, you know, taken into account but I think in terms of the whole recycling, it's not just a local issue, it's a global issue, and we probably have to look at some of the big corporations, particularly fast food, and saying about how we, you know, eat things. You know, apparently, you know, years ago it was we had our chips and newspaper, but that became unhygienic.
The 1 in 5 campaign has been working with Greenpeace regarding plastic straws, and we have been asking governments not to pass the buck, but to push manufacturers to come up with suitable alternatives. Disabled people need plastic straws for hot drinks, for example, and your paper alternatives deteriorate, increases the risk of choking. So we need to look at ways and means, and I think it's important for non-disabled people just to take a step back, draw a breath, and appreciate the fact that there are vulnerable people that need a plastic straw. So not be so quick to judge when there are disabled rights activists that are requesting to have an independent life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you touched on earlier on, Jamie, about the Scottish Government budget, which is coming out this week. From a local authority perspective, guys, what are you hoping to get from the budget?
Well, it's all predicated on this decision that's coming up the next week at Westminster. It all depends. I wish Derek Mackay all the best. As local politicians, we'll be looking for a really good deal for local government. We do realise that he's got a lot of pressures put on him with an ever decreasing block grant. Different ways of doing things. I spoke earlier about a financial revolution. Let's devolve more tax raising powers and revenue to local authorities. For example, roads finance. Every single person that rides a motorcycle, a car, a van, any business that uses the roads in East Ayrshire, every single penny from the taxation raised, from fuel duty to insurance on tax, insurance on insurance, tax on insurance, all of that goes down to Westminster. Is it now time to say, yeah, well, we will take the revenue from our roads, because it's our road users that use the roads? So there's different ways to look at things.
Yeah, certainly from my point of view, there are two areas I would like to see some consideration being given to. One is the health and social care partnerships, because I think they're grossly underfunded. In our own situation in South Ayrshire, we have an increasing older population and the demands for services are just going through the roof. So I'd like to see some realistic projections and additional cash to deal with those issues. And the second thing is education. I think we owe it to our young people to ensure that we reduce the poverty attainment gap, that we put services in there that give the aspiration and technical nous and advantage to our young people to be able to take advantage of the world economy that's around. So those two things, education and health and social care, two major issues that require to be prioritised.
And viewers can look out for our special budget report this week as well to get more information. I'm going to finish today on hopefully a bit of a lighter note. It's been a bit of a heavy hour really, and it's painted a bit of a bleak picture. But I think in terms of being a councillor, I always found the December month a bit more kind of just a nicer month. Usually you're dealing with lots of casework and people that are in difficult circumstances, but December it was always about invitations to come to community groups or events where people were coming together, and it just felt a much nicer month. Now obviously, Jim, you're the Provost, so you'll get lots of invites throughout the year, but do you find December's quite a nice time for people?
Oh, absolutely. Well, being Scotland's rock and roll Provost, 4 motorcycles, I go along, 9 suits I had to buy, broke my heart. But I go along and I really ham it up. I bought a top hat and a cane, the big long jackets. And we go along, just for example, last week was our sheltered accommodation Christmas party. And myself and other councillors had the chain on as well. And we served all of the folk in our sheltered units. And they're absolutely brilliant source of inspiration and knowledge, like the other councils. Our young folk, we've got intergenerational work that goes on. Primary school and secondary school, going to some of our homes for the elderly, and there's this great connect, and it's the laugh. I mean, my sides were sore with the laughs that you get. Schools, absolutely brilliant, because it's all changed now. When I was at school a long time ago, there wasn't that same emphasis on every single person getting involved with a Christmas show. But now when you get into the schools, every single child has got a role to play, and it just it warms the cockles of your heart when you get in there and you see these young things and they're dressed up as angels and fairies and running around, and it's just it gives you a good feeling. The message I would give out, and I give this out every year at this time, although it's all year round, is just chat next door if there's an old body living on their own, maybe their family's moved away. Chat the door, make sure they're okay, get in for a wee cup of tea and a wee yap, try and involve them if you can with the celebrations that your family's having. And that's what society used to be, not advocating for a minute. We go back to the old days because they weren't that good, but the sense of community was a lot better in the old days. And we need to bring that back and get people talking.
I think something nice happens on the 1st of December. People just realise it's the month of Christmas, so they slow down a little bit and they spend more time with their families and reconnect. And I think a couple of the initiatives like the Glasgow Santa run that happened today, we had the big sleep that happened across Scotland, and you know, a lot of communities up and down Scotland are coming together at this time of year, so I think it's a really good opportunity just to take a step back, take a breath, and be thankful of what you've got.
Yes, for me to echo both those sentiments and thoughts. My own experience was yesterday or the day before, actually Friday, going down to Invergarden in Girvan, which is a special needs school, and we did the official opening. We've just refurbished the whole school, and having the Christmas concert there with the young people singing and you know, using Macaton and various things was absolutely wonderful. And what struck me there is the happiness and the contentment in the young people, and I think that was a lesson for me. You know, we can be busy, we can be stressed, we can imagine our lives that are difficult, and we have some problems, but you know, it's to concentrate on, you know, what the attitude of gratitude that we do have a lot going for us, and reaching out to others who are in difficulty is a real boon for yourself, and also for the people who are receiving. So it's a great time of year. It's, you know, midwinter, long nights, but it does bring the best out for people, and it gives me real hope that we can look out for each other, look after each other, and be a community. In the true sense of the word.
Yeah, I think that's right, Brian, and hope's definitely the word. You know, given all the chaos and uncertainty we've spoken about, it's nice to think that actually there is some really good stuff that goes on out there, and we should celebrate that.
And you get Christmas nights out with work.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So that's all we've got time for. Today I'd like to thank Jim, Brian and Jamie for coming along. It's been a really interesting discussion, and obviously I'd like to thank the viewers for watching this afternoon as well. You can, as I said before, we're going to have a special report on the budget this week, so look out for that, and we will see you again next Sunday for the Full Scottish. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Bye.